love bugs, Madame here with you, and today I'm going to do a little review of the Canadian fur trade with you and everything that we have learned up until this point. Now, of course, we have been studying the Canadian fur trade for a month and we've talked about many different things. So today is just going to be a little lesson of about 10 to 15 minutes where I'm going to review everything that we've done, talk about some important people, places, and things that went on during the fur trade. And then next week, we're going to continue with it, and we're going to talk about les voyageurs, les coureurs de bois. We're going to learn a little bit more about what happened when the British and the French were rivals with each other. And we're also going to do some more dancing, some wampum bell beating, and some STEM activities. So be prepared, but before we can do that, we have to do a little review of the fur trade up until this point. Now, we will go over this again next week, just not quite as in much detail, okay? So like I said, we've been doing this for a month. So I'm not going to go over everything in very big detail, but we're going to do a brief outline. So the Canadian fur trade started in the 1600s and it would last for 250 years, which is a very, very long time. And it shaped the way that Canada is today. Now, without the fur trade, Canada would not be the Canada that you know. Now, of course, it started in the 1600s, around 1608, which we'll get to. However, it really started about 70 years before that in 1534. In 1534, there was an explorer called Jacques Cartier who was from France. He was a very famous explorer, and he wanted to find an easier route of getting from France to China. Now, if you look on a map, you'll see that France is really far away from China. And so traveling to Asia was actually pretty difficult back then. They didn't have planes, they didn't have trains, they didn't have cars, they had to travel by boat. So it would take several weeks for people to get all the way from Europe to Asia, even though the continents on a map look like they're actually kind of close together. Now what happened is in 1534, Jacques Cartier started to take a different route, and he thought that he landed in Asia, but he didn't. He actually landed at the top of the St. Lawrence River, right beside the Atlantic Ocean, in a place that we now call Newfoundland. And when he got there, there were different people living there, the indigenous people of Canada, and there was also lots of different things like fish. He had never seen as much cod as he had seen just off the coast of Newfoundland. So over time, Jacques Cartier came back twice, so he did 3 voyages in total between France and Newfoundland, and each time he started to build different relationships with the peoples that lived there, and he also started to learn a little bit more about the area. He brought back some fish, he brought back a few furs, and that is really what started the first relationships with the indigenous peoples of Canada and those in Europe. Now, fast forward several years, there is a second very well-known explorer, and he's super important for Canadian history. So his name is Samuel de Champlain. He was an explorer, a cartographer, a navigator, and very importantly, a geographer. Now, the cartographer is the reason that we really know him because carte comes from the word, cartographer comes from the word carte, which is French for map. So he would go to new areas and map them so that other people could explore them. Now, Samuel de Champlain wanted to explore, and so he ended up doing 21 voyages between France and what is now known as Canada. His first colony he set up was Port Royal, which was in Acadia, which is now New Brunswick, and he set that up from 1604 to 1607. And then he kept traveling up the St. Lawrence River, and he came to a beautiful area that he would call New France. Now, the reason it was called New France was because it was people from France setting up a new area, and they had claimed it for France as a country. Now, he is known as the father of New France because he founded that colony. And of course, New France today is known as, you said Quebec City, you got it right. That's where Madame is from. Because Samuel de Champlain set up New France and it was so successful, he decided to go on and set up more. He set up Trois-Rivières and Marianne. He also set up Tadoussac, even though Tadoussac was not successful. It was only a fur trading fort for 3 years. But he was responsible for setting up 3 major fur trading forts that still exist today. Everyone has heard of Montreal. A lot of us have heard of Trois-Rivières. and most of us have heard of Quebec City. So that is why he's so important. While he was there, he made great trading relationships with the local Indigenous people, and the local Indigenous people really enjoyed getting to know the French as well because they started to trade with each other. Now, I'm not saying that every single relationship was good. What I'm saying is that they did have a relatively good working relationship because it meant that they were learning about different cultures and they were starting to blend together. I'm sorry, I have my notes here so that I don't forget anything. Now, as the colonies started to get set up, like I said, they started to create new trade relations. So these trade relationships were super important because the French wanted something that the Indigenous peoples knew how to trap, and that was furs. Specifically furs such as beaver, bear, rabbit, anything like that, because fur hats were becoming a trend back in France and Europe. And so what happened is in return, they would give things like metal and cloth, just things to make their lives a little bit easier. And the Indigenous peoples began to really enjoy getting to trade because that meant that they could get new things that they had never had. They had never had cloth before. They had to make everything themselves. They had never had metal before. They would carve everything out of wood because they lived off the land. Now, as time progressed, these relationships kept getting stronger and stronger. Sometimes they weren't always getting along, but we'll get to that next week. And so what happened is that while the Indigenous peoples would hunt in the Canadian wilderness, they would then bring it to the three forts or other forts that were beginning to be set up, like Quebec City, and they would trade for the other things that the French had, like the cloth and the metal. Now, it's important to understand because also at this time, there were those French traders that came over from France specifically to create trading relationships with the Indigenous peoples. So essentially what they would do is that the Indigenous peoples would trap and then they would trade with someone from France who would then bring the furs and anything else back to the trading posts. Not only did they bring furs, they also would bring things like fresh meat. Now, those from France, they weren't used to living in the Canadian wilderness. They didn't understand how to trap or how to winter. And so it was really important for them to have these good relationships with the Indigenous peoples so that they were able to do that. Now, at the time, there was also two other very famous fur traders that were from France, and their names were Radisson et Groseilliers. And Radisson and Groseilliers had a really good idea. They knew that going from France to the St. Lawrence River was pretty effective, obviously, because for 50 years they had had a really good relationship trading there. But they had also heard of a huge area of water called the Hudson's Bay. And the Indigenous peoples that lived close to there started telling them about it. And they said that there was lots of beaver pelts and other different types of fur and space to set up fur trading posts up there. Now, when Groseilliers and Radisson went to the King of France to talk about it, he said he wasn't interested in learning a new trading route because what they had been doing for 80 years had been very successful. And so they decided to go to the King of France to the King of England called Charles II. Charles II wasn't really interested in setting up a trading route, but his cousin Prince Rupert was. And so Groseilliers and Radisson helped them set up their own fur trading company, which is called the Hudson's Bay Company. Of course, this is very quick. I'm not getting into all of the details here. Now, the reason that this was super important was because now the British were part of the fur trading game. So they started to set up forts all around the Hudson's Bay. Now, the reason that there became a rivalry was because there was two types of trading. There was the British way, where they would set up a fur trading fort in one area, and then they had everybody come and work for the Hudson's Bay Company. So if you were a fur trader from England, you worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. And all of the Indigenous peoples would come to the forts. The French were very different because most of the people they traded with were more inland rather than on the water. They would travel to the Indigenous communities and then they would bring things back to the fort. Now, the reason that that was so different was because the French did not have an official fur trading company yet. So everyone was working on their own, even though they all came from France. We'll get to that next week though, because that does change as time progresses. And so what happened is you started to see this rivalry between the different groups. And so there was those who really liked getting to trade with the British, and there was those who really liked to trade with the French. Now the French, though, also started to spend winters with their indigenous communities. And while they were there, they often got married and they would have children. And these children were called les métis. Métis comes from the word mélanger in French, which means to mix. So it meant that they had one parent who was from France and one parent who was indigenous. And that is where that word comes from. Now, the community, or the indigenous communities, and the why specifically of the traders were incredibly important. These women had lived off the land for their entire lives, so they knew how to deal with the Canadian wilderness. So they would often be found sewing clothing, making moccasins, and helping prepare food to make sure that their husbands could survive in the winter. And in return, the fur traders would give good trading relationships with France and make sure that those indigenous communities always had a place to trade their furs to. And in return, they would bring things like cloth, metal, guns, different types of food, things like that. Now, of course, this was a very brief overview of what we've done of the fur trade. And like I said, it's a lot to take in. So if this was a lot, I'm really sorry about that. If you found it interesting, that's great. We're going to keep going with it next week. So now your project is that you have a few questions that you have to answer. We've talked about all of these things. However, you might need to do a little bit of research if you forget. So you have 5 questions that you have to answer, okay? If you need any help, remember I'm here, and just know I think you're all amazing. Okay, I love you all and have the best day. Bye, sweet peas.